In Stockholm, a 17-year-old boy collapses onto the grass. The final is over. Brazil have beaten Sweden 5-2. Around him, teammates are moving, shouting, embracing, trying to understand what has just happened. But Pele is not celebrating like a symbol. He is crying like a teenager whose body has reached the limit of the moment. For Brazil, this is the country's first World Cup title. For the rest of the world, something else is beginning. A way to see Brazil, to remember Brazil, and eventually to expect Brazil. But the final itself had not begun as an arrival. Sweden had scored first. The host nation had taken the lead. Brazil, still without a World Cup title, still carrying the memory of 1950, had been forced to answer before it could become an image. That detail matters because the story that later surrounds Brazil often makes 1958 feel effortless. In memory, the tournament can seem almost inevitable. Pele at 17, Garrincha on the right, Brazilian shirts, 5 goals in a World Cup final. The first title finally secured. It can feel as if Brazil simply arrived in Sweden and became itself. The match was not that clean. Before Brazil became a memory, it had to play through pressure. Before Brazil could become a promise, it had to survive a final. Before Pele's tears could become one of football's most recognizable images, Brazil had to respond to being behind. The response came quickly. Garrincha moved on the right with that strange imbalance that made him look almost ungovernable. His body never seemed to announce the same direction as the ball. Defenders had to react to something already changing. Brazil used that instability, not as decoration, but as a way into the match. The ball reached the danger area. Vavá scored. Then Vavá scored again. The final turned. Sweden had opened the match, but Brazil had begun to take possession of its meaning. The score no longer belonged to the host nation. The rhythm no longer belonged to the opening shock. Brazil were not just equalizing. They were beginning to show a form of football different enough to be remembered. For a viewer who knows little about Brazilian football, the outline is simple. Brazil beat Sweden 5-2 in the 1958 World Cup final. It was Brazil's first world title. Pelé was 17 and scored twice. Vavá also scored twice. Zagallo added the other goal. Garrincha unsettled the right side of the field. Didi controlled the game with a calm that made the final seem slower around him. Those are the facts. But the facts alone do not explain why 1958 became so durable. A country can win its first title and leave behind only a result. A final can produce a champion without producing a lasting image. Brazil in Sweden produced both. It won the World Cup, and it gave that victory a shape people could carry. That shape had bodies. Pele's body on the grass, Garrincha's body leaning away from ordinary balance, Didi's upright calm, Vava's direct movement toward goal, Zagallo's work on the left, connecting talent to responsibility. These were not abstract signs of identity. They were footballers inside a match. But afterward, memory would make them stand for something larger. The final was played far from Brazil. That distance matters. The country's first title did not arrive in Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo. It arrived in Sweden, in a European stadium, against the hosts, before an audience that could watch Brazil without already belonging to Brazilian football's private history. That distance changed the scale of the victory. Brazil's first title did not only confirm the team at home, it placed Brazilian football inside an international frame, where style could become reputation. That made the victory easier to translate. Brazil was not only speaking to itself, it was being seen from outside. And what the outside world saw was unusually easy to remember. The teenager, the dribble, the score, the tears, the first title, and the Brazilian shirt. It did not require deep knowledge of Brazil's politics, language, geography, or social life. Football became the entrance. Through the game, Brazil became legible before many people understood anything else about the country. The yellow shirt was central to Brazil's wider legibility. But the final itself complicates that image. It was not born in 1958. Brazil had already moved away from the white shirt after the trauma of 1950. The yellow shirt already existed before Sweden, but Brazil did not play that afternoon in yellow. Sweden wore yellow too, and as hosts, they kept their color. Brazil played the final in blue. That detail does not weaken the symbol. It shows how memory can simplify even the objects it loves. After that tournament, the yellow was no longer only a uniform. It had proof around it. That proof was not only the trophy, it was the manner of the victory.
Brazil did not win 1-0 in a closed final that could be admired only by specialists. It won 5-2. It fell behind, answered, widened the match, and ended with a score that seemed to turn pressure into clarity. Sweden's early goal gave the final danger. Brazil's response gave it shape. Pele's first goal in the final became part of that shape. He controlled the ball in the box, lifted it over a defender, and finished before the moment could become too heavy. It was still just a football action. Touch, decision, execution. But it would be remembered as something more than a goal because it seemed to compress the future into one movement.
A 17-year-old was not only participating in Brazil's first title, he was making the future visible. That is one reason Pele's tears matter so much. They give the victory a human scale before the myth grows too large. The image is powerful because he is not yet the monument that later memory will make of him. He is a boy on the grass, overcome. The world can understand that before it understands anything else. This is where 1958 begins to move beyond the match without leaving the match behind. The football itself gives the story its force. Garrincha's dribbling makes Brazil look unpredictable. Pele's youth makes Brazil look possible. Vava's goals make beauty practical. Didi's control keeps the team from becoming pure disorder. Zagallo's presence reminds us that even expressive football needs work without the ball. The team is often remembered as natural genius, and that memory is not empty. There was genius there. The movement really did look different. The players really did give Brazil a kind of expressive power that could not be reduced to efficiency. But the word natural can hide too much. It can hide the structure that allowed invention to survive. Garrincha's disorder needed a team around it. Pele's youth needed timing and protection. Didi's calm gave rhythm to moments that could otherwise have become loose. Vava gave the attack a center. Zagallo helped balance the side. Brazil did not win because imagination floated above organization. It won because imagination had enough organization underneath it to remain useful. That is the quiet tension inside 1958. The world fell in love with the freedom, but the freedom was not alone. It had roles, it had spacing, it had responsibilities, it had a final to win. The football could look spontaneous because the team was coherent enough to let spontaneity appear without collapsing into chaos. Over time, the simpler version became easier to repeat. Brazil as joy, Brazil as rhythm. Brazil as the shirt and the dribble. Brazil as a place where football comes naturally. There is truth in that image, but it is a partial truth. It remembers what the football felt like and often forgets what made that feeling possible. Still, the simpler version traveled because it worked. It gave international audiences a usable story. It made Brazilian football recognizable. It allowed people who had never lived inside Brazilian football to feel they understood something about it. A team became a style. A style became a national image. A national image became an expectation. That is the deeper importance of 1958. Brazil's first World Cup did not simply reveal a football identity. It gave that identity a visible form the world could recognize, repeat, and expect again. The final against Sweden matters not only because Brazil won. It matters because Brazil won while looking different. The difference was not just tactical or technical. It was visual, emotional, and memorable. Garrincha gave the story disorder. Pele gave it youth. The trophy gave it permanence. And the 5-2 score made the whole thing feel complete.
The score matters because it simplifies the memory. It says dominance, even though the match began with Brazil behind. It says arrival, even though the story was still being made. It says clarity, even though the path to that clarity passed through pressure. That is how football memory often works. It does not preserve every uncertainty. It keeps the images that can be used again. In 1958, those images were unusually strong. Pele crying, Garrincha dribbling, the Brazilian shirt, the first title, 5 goals in a final, a country seen from far away and suddenly made visible through football.
From that point, Brazil begins to mean more than the team on the field. In football language, it begins to carry a promise. It can suggest imagination before a ball is kicked. It can suggest beauty before a match begins. It can suggest talent, youth, rhythm, and expressive freedom, even when the real team is more complicated than the image. That promise gives Brazil prestige. It also creates a burden. Because once Brazil becomes associated with beautiful football, later Brazil teams are not judged only by results. They are judged by resemblance. Do they look like Brazil? Do they honor the shirt? Do they continue the story? Do they disappoint the image? This is the problem 1958 creates. The first title ends one kind of waiting and begins another kind of demand. Before Sweden, Brazil had been a gifted football nation searching for its first World Cup. After Sweden, Brazil becomes the country expected to make football beautiful while winning. That is a harder inheritance than it first appears.
A normal champion can change. It can become cautious, practical, defensive, efficient, and still be understood as a champion responding to time. Brazil can do those things too, but not without friction. The image from 1958 remains nearby. It asks later teams to explain why they do not look like the memory. That image did not stay inside sport alone. It became available to newspapers, broadcasters, advertisers, federations, supporters, and future World Cups. It could be replayed, printed, narrated, packaged, and demanded. The myth became a kind of infrastructure, not a physical structure, but a story strong enough to organize judgment. And yet, it began with footballers inside a real final. That is important, because reducing 1958 to branding would flatten the moment in the opposite direction. Pele's tears were not strategy. Garrincha's dribble was not a slogan. Vava's goals were not symbols when he scored them. They were actions in a match Brazil needed to win. The emotional truth came first. Brazil won its first World Cup. A country that had carried the unresolved pain of 1950 could finally see its football confirmed at the highest level. The players had lived the tension before anyone turned it into an origin story. The title mattered before it became useful. But because the victory came with such clear images, it did become useful. It became a way to explain Brazil quickly. It became a way to remember Brazilian football, even for people who had not seen the tournament. It became a way to sell, celebrate, criticize, and compare. It became a standard that future teams would inherit without ever being asked. This is why 1958 should not be remembered only as a happy beginning. It is an arrival, but it is also the creation of a frame. From that point on, Brazilian football does not move through history empty-handed. It carries a version of itself, a beautiful version, a powerful version, a version that opens doors and narrows possibilities at the same time.
The later history of Brazil at the World Cup is shaped by that inheritance. Later teams will win beautifully, win pragmatically, lose painfully, defend themselves, disappoint people, and be measured against something that began before many of their players were born. They will not only be compared to opponents, they will be compared to Brazil. And Brazil, in that football sense, becomes visible in Stockholm. The image is still there. The final over, the score settled, the teenager on the grass. Around him, Brazil's players are world champions for the first time. The moment belongs to them before it belongs to history. But history takes it quickly. It takes the tears, the shirt, the score, the names, and the feeling of a country arriving. It turns them into a story that can travel. It makes Brazilian football easier to love from far away. It also makes Brazilian football harder to be, because every later version has to stand somewhere in relation to that first image. Brazil's first World Cup did not simply make the country champion. It gave the world a Brazil it could recognize. And once that Brazil existed, the Brazilian shirt was never only a shirt again.